I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief of Business in Vancouver. Today's podcast is part 2 in a series of 4, examining the intricacies and challenges of buying and selling a business. Today's is part 2 about buying a business. It's part of our Business Excellence series, and it's sponsored by the law firm of Richards Buell Sutton and the financial services firm Roynat Capital. My guests are experienced and expert in the complex terrain of acquiring a business, and I think the next 20 minutes or so is going to be a valuable education for you. I'm going to stay with you on this one, Jason, to start. So many buyers have such a passion for what it is that they're trying to acquire. Their hearts are totally into it, and they might get very far down the road and not be the ones to right away understand that perhaps this isn't the right deal. How do you counsel people on how to know when to walk away?
Ooh, that's because I kind of try not to counsel people to walk away.
I know you do, but there must be times where you don't want to walk somebody off the side of a cliff either.
At the end of the day, it has to be a good fit. I think Arturo would be the same. Any good broker, or any broker with experience is only going to succeed if we're trying to marry the right fit. If it's a good fit, if the buyer and seller, it's a good fit, we're going to go down that road. The last thing I really want to do, I joked at the beginning there, but the last thing I want to do is sell a business to someone that it's not a good fit. I think that there's a point, because it's never a straight line. You're gonna have lots of obstacles. Like if you're buying a business, the bank's gonna turn you down. Then you add some other financing, and then there's some legal problems, and then there's a buyer and seller fighting. It's never going to be a straight line. So you have to just kind of keep banging down walls. But I think there becomes a point when buyer has to just kind of trust their gut. When you know it's going south, get out of Dodge. And you'll find that, generally speaking, the professionals in this industry will help you out the door when it's time to pack it in.
Yeah. Arturo?
Yeah, and there's certainly some red flags in the way, right? If your buyer sees that the financials look sketchy or something like that, or just things just don't add up, the buyer should not become emotional or I need to do this, okay, and be rational and step away, right? Sometimes things don't work for a reason, right? So
yeah, David, though, people are going to get emotional about all this. This is where their heart is trying to lead them. How do you make sure that the head stops them here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Especially once the lawyers and the advisors get involved, they're starting to spend money on people. People get invested in the transaction. It's hard to take that objective look and step away from it. But it is something it's crucial for a buyer to constantly be reassessing the transaction as they're proceeding, because they're going to be getting more and more information as the transaction goes along. And sometimes you do need to, put a pause on it, take a step back, think about it. Sometimes I tell my clients, let's not respond right away. Let's take some time, like mull it over the weekend or take a few days to reflect, to make sure that you're ready to proceed, especially when there have been some red flags coming up, something that really gives you pause about whether to proceed with the transaction.
Is it necessarily so that when a vendor is really pressing for a sale in a hurry, that is an automatic red flag, or can that frankly just be a reasonable requirement?
I wouldn't say that's necessarily uncommon. Some of my vendor clients as well, once they decide they want to sell, their heart's not into it anymore. They want to get out. Mm-hmm. But within reason, if they're, sometimes that does give you the ability to negotiate things in your favor. If one party's desperate to proceed with a transaction, it gives you the upper hand. And so maybe you're willing to proceed, but you can get some additional protections in place, or some more advantageous terms.
Yeah. And so, Derek, when do you often get the sense that, I better take this person and walk them away from this deal?
Yeah, I think if you're a buyer looking at a business, before you get too much involved, you should write down like the 10 most important reasons why you're buying this business. Mm-hmm. And, if it's price is one of them, and the price just starts moving too much, it's probably a reason to leave. I see a lot of times where people will go down the garden path of the company and the price just keeps changing. And so, you got to stick to your guns sometimes, because you'll overpay for a business and you'll end up regretting it. I think the other thing is, you need to listen to your advisors, and I'm always coming back to this, but as we talked about, that includes your banker, and hopefully you as a purchaser. I would say, it's important for you to hire an M&A advisor as well. You shouldn't just be using the M&A advisor of the seller, because that person's going to come with their own level of experience, and they're going to be able to provide you knowledge. And then your lawyer, and I mean, if let's say your banker says, well, this is just getting too rich for me, or the lawyer starts bringing up all these concerns about, the way the deal is structured, or the fact they're not giving any reps and warranties, or your M&A advisor says, well, you're paying 8 times for a business, then, that should be transacting at 4 times. You need to listen to those things. You need to take a step back, take a deep breath, and say, there's a reason why I brought these people in, and stick to your guns and walk from the deal if it's not going to work.
David, so let's say the deal is going to be done, but you're not exactly sure about many things involving the business. You're going to need some support after the transaction is conducted. What kind of counsel do you give clients about what post-sale support is wise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when acting for a buyer, the more rights to have post-sale support, the better. So if you can get the vendor to commit to, consultation and maybe helping with the transition, you may not need it afterwards, but it's good to have the option. And the amount of support that's necessary will really depend on the buyer and how sophisticated they are, whether they're familiar with the business, the industry or not. But it is also important for buyers to get in there, to take ownership of what they're acquiring, to not rely on the vendor after the fact if they can help it. It should be, almost a last resort as they go forward. So they should have their own systems in place, their own.
Do you end up holding back money?
Sometimes, yeah. If that's a serious concern, if it's if assistance is required, we'll, whether it's in the form of a holdback or an out or some other mechanism, we can include a financial incentive for the vendors to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Derek, what kind of post-sale support do you feel is wise?
Yeah, I mean, I would think when I look at a deal and say this is a well-structured deal, I'm looking for some form of vendor financing in a transaction so that the vendors actually take carrying some of the risk going forward. I'm looking for making sure that there's the purchase and sale agreement includes things like non-competes, a management contract so that the owners obligated to continue to provide advice and counsel to the business. Those are 2 really crucial things that I'm looking for in a deal from frankly the vendor side, to make sure that there's some continuity going forward.
Yeah. Arturo, pick up on that. What kind of post-sale support do you think is necessary?
I also think it depends a lot on the type of business, right? Some of them would require a much longer or more support from the seller. Probably more of a retail business of things would just be basic training. But of course, if the business has specific clients, contracts, or if the business depends a lot on is very attached to the owner, okay? If the owner is totally the face of that business, then it will require a much longer transition. Yeah, it's basically important to ask for, to request it.
Mm-hmm. Jason?
Yeah, and the buyer definitely wants to negotiate how much time the seller is going to stick around while in negotiations. Don't wait until the deal's done to be asking the seller to stick around. Most deals that I do, we usually include 2 to 3 months of the seller staying around full time after the deal. And then in some cases, like Arturo mentioned, where sometimes it's very client specific, well, we might drag out those introductions and meetings over a 6-month period. And so it's part-time for 6 months, or other times it's full-time for 2 months. So it's somewhere in that zone. But if a buyer starts negotiating that while negotiating price and terms, they'll be much better served. And the seller will mostly be quite honest of how much they would be needed. Like a lot of times the sellers will say, listen, I need to stick around for 4 months. They'll be toast without me if I go after 2 months. So it's got to be a trust. There's got to be a high level of trust in order for a deal to happen.
And I'll conclude with this and want to hear from each of you about what surprises you think generally you might expect along the way here. Derek, why don't you start with this?
Surprises that come up during the transaction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, certainly the emotional aspect of selling your business and the impact that has on the vendor, and the reasons for them potentially pulling out of a deal can surprise you. I'd say that's where I've seen deals fall apart more times than not because the vendor just starts to worry about what they're going to do with the rest of their life, and they decide to keep the business. That's a big. I think that's one of the reasons why I see deals fail is the vendor really wasn't ready to sell their business, which surprises me after somebody goes through a process for anywhere from 6 months up to a year, and then they make that decision at the last moment.
Yeah, David, what surprises do you typically stumble over?
Yeah, actually, one of them that Derek touched on is vendors not being ready to sell, and sometimes that happens after they've sold, and then they realize they don't want to be out of it. They want to get back in, and
vendor remorse.
Vendor remorse, and another important reason to get proper, restricted covenants in place over the vendor, so they can't come back into the industry and compete directly against you after you've spent all this money acquiring their business. Other things, that also relates to the employees. If they're not properly tied down, you can always worry about them jumping ship after transactions completed, or maybe right before, once they get wind of the transaction going on, as well as making sure that the business owns what it should own, and that there's sometimes there will be liens that aren't expected over certain of the assets that you're supposed to be acquiring, complications like that can come up as we go through our due diligence.
Yeah. Jason?
One of the things that often blindsides a buyer is their spouse. I call it the wife card. If you don't really early, and when I'm talking to a buyer, I make sure their wife's on board, because a lot of times a buyer can spend a good month in due diligence, the deal's negotiated, they're happening, and then their wife tells them they don't want to risk their entire net worth, and they don't want their husband gone 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, which is what will happen in the first year of any business. So
let's be clear too that this could
your
be
home team
that you have to consult, and the wife might be the buyer. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty important to mention. Arturo?
Well, there are always surprises, but besides the appearance of a pandemic, okay, like this was a big surprise, okay. I mean, all the emotional aspects, right? I mean, at the very end, change your mind, or things that probably the buyer thought that were included on the sale, and then the seller comes, oh, this, by the way, this is not included in the sale. So, and therefore the price or the terms change, right? So that's why always the recommendation is to as soon as possible, even at the LOI stage, to put the most detail that you can, I mean, from the buyer side, of what you want and what to expect. So there are no more negotiations further down the road, or at the less possible negotiations.
Good. Well, listen, we're going to cut our conversation off to our podcast, but I want to thank the four of you to discuss the idea of buying a business. David Harvey with Richards Buell Sutton, Derek Strong with Roynat Capital, Jason Brice, jasonbrice.com online, and Arturo Kalb with Murphy Business Broker. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for your time.
Thank you.
Join us for part 3 of our conversation tomorrow. All of the series can be found later this week at BIV.com. I'm Kirk Lapointe, publisher and editor-in-chief at Business in Vancouver. Thanks for joining us.